Alrighty, so today I wanted to bring something special to the channel. I spent the better part of the past year creating Tropico 6 content. I've created and uploaded almost every other day, and at the time of recording this video, I've uploaded over 150 videos on Tropico 6. With this time spent playing the latest installment of one of my most favorite city building and resource management games, I've gained a lot of knowledge about Tropico through trial and error, and through dozens and dozens of helpful comments from all of you guys. With this wealth of knowledge gained, I've also mulled over all the things that I wished were in the game, and small adjustments that could be added to make the gameplay smoother for casual gamers and hardcore gamers alike. So without further ado, I bring to you guys 10 things that I want to see in Tropico 7. I hope you enjoy. Kicking off the list at number 1 is an in-game encyclopedia. As it currently stands, all the in-game information can be gathered by mousing over different tooltips in the various menus, and by poring over the almanac. However, it would be nice to have an in-game encyclopedia to expose all the lesser known details of buildings, edicts, and everything else in the game. Which buildings will make the conservative faction upset? What does increasing the budget of a grocery accomplish? How many iron mines will a steel mill require to function? As it stands, you can figure most things out about the game, but there's still a lot left up in the air. There's tons of questions that could easily be answered in an in-game encyclopedia, and I'm sure that the entire player base would be much happier that any questions that they could possibly have could easily be answered. I don't think this would be terribly difficult to add, and it would be a nice spot to address any minute details of the lesser known mechanics in Tropico. But moving on to entry number 2, more building presets and building customization. I've built dozens of different islands with various flavors and objectives in mind while going into it. I've made perfect communist utopias, sprawling capitalist metropolises, military dictatorships, and even, at one point, a very scary dystopia devoid of all personal liberty. I've had a lot of fun making all these different islands, and if you want to check them out, I highly recommend checking out the final few episodes of each of the playlists that I made for each of my island playthroughs. The final few episodes are where you're going to find the fully fleshed out form of the islands. However, making each of these islands was no simple task. They each took a fair bit of forethought, and once I fully got into building up each of them, I only had a limited supply of different looking buildings. There's only so much that you can do creatively with the exact same tavern building, the exact same office building, and a very limited selection of various residential buildings. Even in my most valiant efforts, I often find myself spamming buildings. It'd be really nice to see a much larger amount of variation amongst the different building presets. I hate having to build the exact same bank over and over with the exact same footprint as the last one. It'd be really nice if you had a lot more flexibility with the way that buildings looked, and maybe even with the way that they function. It'd be cool to see a single floor office building that only had 2 worker slots, or a skyscraper bank that had 10 worker slots. It would also be really nice to be able to fully customize the buildings from the ground up, change the outside ground tile, building height, color schemes. I think that there's a lot that could be done to allow for a tremendous amount of creative freedom. Even when I was a kid and I didn't understand much about the games, my favorite buildings were the ones that had a lot of different building presets, and it would add a lot to everyone's islands if there was vastly more variation amongst the buildings. So moving on, and coming in at number 3 would be a better transportation system. In its current state, the entire transportation system is quite lackluster. It's clunky at the best of times and outright malfunctional at the worst. It would be nice to see a huge facelift for the entire transportation system. One of the smaller things that I think would be nice to be implemented into the game would be car ownership by Tropicans. As it stands, the only people who can afford to drive cars in Tropico are people in the rich class. And the system is a bit silly to say the least. If a Tropican finds themselves in the rich class and they are in a building with road access and intend to go to another building with road access, they will magically spawn a car and drive it to their destination. I think it would be nice to have a car dealership that could sell cars to your population. A work mode could be implemented to allow even poor Tropicans to buy them. Parking decks could be a place for Tropicans to park their car for a while, and if none were close, they could simply park them on the side of the road like they do in City Skyline. The way I think that would work best would be to have the cars owned by families. Depending on which class they were in and which work mode dealerships were on, they'd be able to purchase cars over the course of time. Richer families would be able to have their entire family own cars very quickly, and poor families would only have a car or two. It'd be pretty cool to be able to produce cars in a factory and sell them to your own population and slowly watch as your factories populated your streets. And if you didn't feel like setting up your own vehicle factory, then simply importing cars would achieve the same goal. A simple solution to another transportation issue is to implement bus routes. The way it currently works is Tropicans will take a bus if it'll help them get closer to their destination, and the bus will simply drive back and forth between 2 bus stops. I think it would be nice if you could have bus routes, as this would allow you to do things like setting up a bus route that could travel to a distant industrial zone, picking up and dropping off workers before circling back to your city, or even just having 2 buses travel in opposite directions in a downtown area to help move your population around. Another thing that also needs a serious rework is the way that Tropicans pathfind roads. Sometimes it feels like the entire population will try to use a single road, and once a few cars inevitably bug out, half your population will be stuck in a never-ending traffic jam. Something that I think would be nice to see would be if Tropicans chose routes that were effective only part of the time. It would be nice if they noticed that a road was congested and they chose to go down an alternate route, or maybe even just chose to go down a completely random route just to mix things up. Half the roads that I've ever made were never really used by more than a few cars, and it would be neat to see them all in use. And finally, something that I think would make the entire road system a bit better overall would be to add customizable intersections. A very simple system that I think would go a long way would be to allow players to change intersections from stop signs to traffic lights, and to allow players to change how long each light is green for in each direction. Currently, one lane of traffic will start to flow, and then it won't stop until a seemingly random break in the traffic, at which point the other lane will take over. It works decently well for smaller amounts of traffic, but once the cars really start to pile up, it quickly turns into a nightmare traffic situation. It would be really nice to see the entire road system work a lot more seamlessly without it having to be the center of attention like it is for a game like Cities Skylines. Next up on our list of entries is crowd and pedestrian mechanics. Tropico games have always been about your Tropicans. What do you have them do? What are their wants and needs? Will they continue to vote for you or rebel against you? The way that I always thought about Tropico games is that it's an ant farm with political ideologies. And as someone who's quite fond of taking any downtime to zoom in and marvel at my creations, I find it rather drab that the only real random scenes that you'll ever witness is the occasional robbery. I think it would add so much to the game to be able to zoom in, and what you would see is crowds doing what represent the state of affairs for your citizens. This could also be used as a way to increase the population's various happinesses as well. Sometimes you would be able to see people setting up market stalls to sell produce if the food happiness was low, or maybe public speeches could be given to increase liberty. It'd be really cool to zoom in on your population and see visual cues from your people as to what their wants and needs are. If you zoom in and you see crowds gathering on the streets with signs and torches, then you would know that open rebellion is right around the corner. There's so much that simply adding crowds to the game would allow for, besides simply making the game look a lot more intriguing. It would also be pretty nice to see Tropicans actually use some of the parks that you place around. I also think that just some general pathfinding fixes could be added to the game. Like something smaller that I've noticed on a lot of my builds is that if you build up an entire area diagonal to the starting grid, then the entire population will make walking in a jagged route, and everyone will be walking into the road, which I think really takes a lot away from an area that you spend a lot of time trying to make look nice. Coming in halfway down our list at number 5 is more in-depth family mechanics. It would be really nice to be able to have the family mechanics fleshed out a bit. I've tried on a few occasions to only have certain families in control of the jobs that have the highest wages. If you go about it correctly, you could potentially have an entire family all making a wage of over $10 a month, and every member will push the family further into the rich class. This would have some really overpowered effects for your regime, as you could make it so that everyone else on the island would all be poor, and then you can make it so that only the rich would be allowed to vote. Then all you gotta do is make sure that these rich families are all very happy, and you have a system where you could ignore the lower class's needs in a brutal dictatorship styled island. The only problem with this is that it's really difficult to shuffle Tropicans around for a certain job. Also, clicking through the family trees, as they are now, is really burdensome. You only get to see each Tropican's most immediate family members, and it's really easy to get turned around and not know who is who. It'd be really helpful if you got a screen that showed the entire family as well as any links to other families. A family screen could also show a family's overall wealth, which could affect their overall abilities on the island. Another major use for a more useful family system would be to allow for only certain families to work in certain buildings. This would allow for a very easy way to control who is rich and who gets to live in the rich neighborhoods near the palace. I think that a revamped family system would be perfect for adding to the crime system as well. As it is now, the only people who ever become criminals are individuals who don't have a job, and as we all know, that's hardly how crime works in real life. It would be pretty crazy to have full-on crime families on your island. I think that it would add a lot to your Tropico islands if you were able to create, manipulate, and interact with various families. But moving on to the 6th entry on our list, I would really like to see some much needed changes to the way that capitalism is addressed in Tropico. As it is now, no matter what you really do on your island, it will categorically always be a communist island, as you, the leader, are always going to be in total control. The communist versus capitalism system really only lies in which edicts you activate or shy away from, as well as which factions you influence everyone towards or away from. This is perfect, but I think that a major thing that could be added to the game would be to allow for richer families to actually invest their own wealth into the island. It would be cool to have a family come to you with the intention of investing a variable amount of money into various buildings. Maybe they want to set up a new hospital or a new grocery or their own set of industrial buildings. Of course, if you went through with letting them set up some buildings, you would get the buildings for cheaper, but you would also reap less of the rewards. This could be a cool system, and eventually you could relinquish control of the buildings entirely, and maybe even at some point you could have the entire island ran off the population while you simply collect taxes like a true capitalist government. Next on our list at number 7, I would love to see the military portions of the game have a lot more detail. well. Currently, if you're playing in single player, the only real military actions that you can perform and witness are defending your island from invasions as well as from rebellion. Even then, anytime military actions happen on your island, most of the time it will be wildly predictable and you won't really have too much control over what's going to happen. Outside of the island, you can't really do much. The only thing that I can really think of is the fact that you can send workers from one of your raid buildings to perform various raids, and the only real militant one is from the commando garrisons, where you can send your commandos to harass your Caribbean neighbors. I think it would be a fun addition to the game to actually be able to send troops away to various military happenings around the world, be it historical or not. It would also be nice if in the very least you were able to have some control of the troops under your command while they were deployed to defend your island. Currently, you can only decide if platoons should focus on engaging attackers or defending buildings, and oftentimes they will simply walk right by enemies like they aren't even there. Sometimes I feel that setting up military buildings should be avoided altogether and instead opt for pacifism so you don't really need to deal with the clunky fights. But moving on to entry number 8. This one's a bit more nuanced, but I hope that someday you'll be able to bury factions in the next installment of Tropico. Now what does this mean? Well, the way that it works in Tropico 6 is that if you get a faction standing to increase, everyone who follows this faction will get a bonus to their personal experience, and this will increase their support of El Presidente. So if you influence most of the island towards a specific faction, then support that faction with edicts, buildings, and constitution topics, you can get near 100% support from your Tropicans pretty easily. Besides just trying to get a high support, factions are one of the most important aspects of an island if you want to add some flavor to your build, as well as greatly affect which buildings you can construct. Factions all have buildings that they both support and oppose being constructed on the island. Influence a lot of people towards the communist faction, then build up a bunch of mansions, and you'll lose a lot of support. So you need to be careful which buildings that you use based on which factions you have on the island. Environmentalists hate industrial buildings, and conservatives hate renewable energy sources, and so on. Now all of this is fine, as it works in the opposite direction as well. Every faction has buildings that they do like to be constructed on the island, and it's through all of these methods that allow you to build your island up in a specific way that will also let you reap plenty of support. If you influence everyone towards the capitalist faction, then build up a bunch of mansions, you'll get all the capitalists to pledge their support to you. The only issue that I have with this system is that the factions that you influence everyone away from will still get upset and issue ultimatums even if there are literally no people following this faction. It would be nice if at a certain threshold the faction would stop with the ultimatums. Like if you influenced everyone to the point that, let's say, less than 10% of the population followed a faction, you should be able to disable their ability to issue ultimatums. It hardly makes sense that if there's almost no capitalists on the island, you still have to deal with the capitalist demands, or else you have to deal with their ultimatums, and if you ignore it, the ultimatum falls through, and for an entire year all prices are doubled and exports are halved. This would be a huge incentive to influence everyone towards a certain faction and to fully support that faction at the expense of the opposing faction. At a certain point you'd be able to go all in and you could let the opposing faction's support drop to 0. As it stands now, if you let this happen, you have to deal with ultimatums constantly. But next up at number 9, we have more world building. As you're the leader of an entire country, I think it would make sense to be able to make a difference in the world at large. Currently, you're really only able to interact with only a few things outside of the island. You can influence the standings with only superpowers, you can create trade routes that are really beneficial for both you and your Caribbean neighbors with the Caribbean Trade Pact Association, and you can send your commandos to harass your neighbors. Besides this, you don't really have any way to influence the world. It would be pretty cool to be able to change things about the world at something like a world leader meeting. Causing mischief and causing wars would lead to weapons exporting for a higher price. Griping to the world about pollution could affect all sorts of goods like coal and uranium. Creating good relations with your Caribbean neighbors could allow for trade routes between your countries that doesn't rely on an edict that has a 4-year cooldown. There's lots of things that could be happening in the in-game world that you could be affecting as the leader of an entire country, and I think it would add a lot of fun and replayability to interact with the world outside of your island. But moving on to the final entry in our list is having more control over the economy. You do have almost complete control over the economy, but it would be nice to have absolute control over it. To be more exact, the only thing that I would hope for is the ability to completely control which classes everyone belongs to. In Tropico 6, if you want to have a high food happiness on your island, no matter what, you have to have some poor Tropicans. You have to build up some groceries and shopping malls, and these buildings only have a maximum wage of only $9 a month. If every single building in the game could at least provide a wage of $10 a month or more, then you could have an entire island where every single person would be able to make it into the well-off class. Likewise, it would be nice if you could allow the wages of every building to drop into very low numbers. Currently, if you want to have the entire population in the poor class in a true Marxist fashion, then you will have to go without some amenities. The only way to provide any sort of healthcare requires either super low effectiveness, or you have to gamble whether or not some people will be in a class above everyone else. It would be nice if even the most expensive buildings like banks, hospitals, and offices would all provide a wage of less than $10 a month on their lowest budgets. Of course, this would be extremely detrimental to the effectiveness of the buildings, but in the very least, you'd be able to have complete control over your economy, and you could have everyone be in the poor class or ensure that nobody stays in the poor class and everyone makes it at least into the well-off class. This would also allow you to have a backward system where the lower class workers get paid more than the bankers and lawyers, which I think you should be able to do in a game like Tropico. But that's everything that I have for today's video. I really hope that you guys enjoyed. If you did, be sure to leave a like, and if you have some ideas of your own that you'd like to see in Tropico 7, then drop a comment down below. Peace.